I'm going to demonstrate 7 different training techniques, and whilst we're training, Barney will get positive reinforcement with food, hot dogs I'm using, each time he does a behaviour that I want more of and I want to encourage him to do, and this will make it more likely that he'll do these behaviours again in the future. Once the behaviour is established and he knows it and it's on cue, then we'll move to a more variable rate of reinforcement, and that will make the behaviour more resistant to extinction. So the first technique we're going to use today is shaping, and shaping allows us to break a behaviour down into small segments and reinforce successive approximations of the final behaviour. Generally we use a clicker in conjunction with shaping, and a clicker makes a noise like this, and it allows us to mark the exact point that the behaviour happened that we want to reinforce the dog for, we want to encourage him to do again. Before we can use the clicker in training, we need to use classical conditioning to condition the dog to the sound of the clicker, so he associates the sound of the clicker with receiving the food. And to do this we click and treat, click and treat about 30 times. Do this a couple of times a day for maybe 1 or 2 days, and we're ready to use we'll be ready to use the clicker in training. Now everything else we do, this is classical conditioning, but everything else we do today will be primarily operant conditioning. The clicker itself is a secondary reinforcer for the food, which is the primary reinforcer. So the first behaviour we're going to do is down, and if we were going to train a Barney at down with shaping, we might watch for any head movements, and his head went down there, so I clicked and I reinforced. We might watch for any, that was a bit slow, wasn't it? We might watch for any head movements, and if he puts his head down at all, we'll click and we'll reinforce that behaviour. And all things in nature are variable, so some movements with his head will be bigger movements than others, so we'll stop rewarding the small movements and we'll just reinforce the bigger movements with his head as he puts his head down like that. A bigger movement like that's very nice, until we stop reinforcing these small movements and just the bigger movements, and then bigger movements again, until the dog's all the way down on the floor and we've trained the down using shaping. If we was going to train Barney to sit using shaping, if we was going to train Barney to sit using shaping, we might watch his back end, and if he took the weight off his back legs, we might click and reinforce that. And then if he started to lower his back end in the slightest, we'd click and reinforce that, and we'd start ignoring the small movements and just start reinforcing the bigger movements until he's all the way down sitting on the floor. Now if we was going to do loose lead walking using clicker training, Barney won't pull on a lead, but if you've got a dog that pulls on a lead a lot, then as soon as they release the pressure in the slightest, we could click and reinforce that behaviour, and then when they start taking more pressure off the lead, we could click and reinforce that behaviour, and all the way in and shape that behaviour right in until the dog's very close up to us. So if we can get Barney to, once Barney comes into position, he's right close to me there, so I'm going to click and reinforce that, and in that way you've shaped the dog right in by your side in that way. And the advantage to shaping is that you can train quite complex behaviours in very small parts, and if you are not getting the behaviour that you want, he's not offering the behaviours that you want, you can go back and start at an easier level and make the behaviour much easier. Good boy. The downside to using shaping in training is that your thumb's always on the clicker ready to click, and it's easy to click by mistake and reinforce the wrong behaviour. So we're going to move on now to lure and reward, and a lure is anything that the dog is going to be attracted towards, so we can use it to get the dog to follow. I'm using hot dog, so we can hold that in the hand and we can get the dog to follow it round and change his position. So if we wanted to do a sit using the lure and reward, come here, we'd hold it above his nose and take it backwards, and we would release when he goes into the sit. And if we was going to do the down, we'd take the food just under his chin, take it down, and in a backwards motion towards the dog's back end and away from us, and this stops him just going into the bow, and it encourages him more to go into the sit. Barney, stand up, stand. I'll just start him in the stand position. Stand. And I'll release the food as soon as he's down on the floor. For loose lead walking, if we're using lure and reward, we would just hold the food where we want him on a nice loose lead, lure him in onto a loose lead and release the food once he's in nice and close or on a loose lead wherever we want him. Now adding cues to these behaviours, all of them, The best time to add a cue is when you can comfortably predict that the dog is going to do the behaviour. So the dog can associate your cue word with actually doing the behaviour. So if it was a sit, just as he starts to go into the sit, starts the movement, or just a fraction of a second before, as long as you can predict he's going to do it, then that's the best time to add the cue word. So you can build up that good association with the action that happens after the cue word, and then getting reinforcement for that. So we're going to move on to lure and click, and lure and click is very similar to lure and reward, but it allows us to use the clicker to mark the behaviour that the dog did. So if we was doing the sit, we'd do exactly the same as we did before. We'd click as he goes down, and we've marked that behaviour, and the same for the down. We would hold the food below the chin and take it down to the ground. Stand. And we've clicked to mark the behaviour, and the same with the loose lead walking. We could lure him in close to us, and as he gets into the position we're wanting him, we can click and mark that behaviour. So we're using the click and we're using the luring. The downside, the advantage to lure is to luring these behaviours is that it's an easy way to get the dog moving straight away into a position where you might want him and start a behaviour off. And the disadvantage is that he may become dependent on you having something in your hand before he shows you his attention, and he may start to ignore it when you haven't got anything in his hand because he knows there's nothing there for him. So we can phase out the lure over time. We can, once we've got the dog used to following the lure, we can take the lure out of our hand and put it away and just let the dog follow the empty hand, and he will do that like this, and then and we'll take the lure from somewhere else where he didn't see it previously and give it to him that way. And we've phased out the lure. Now we're going to move on to technique 4, and technique 4 is targeting. Targeting is teaching the dog to touch anything at all with any body part, and a good example of that, a simple example of that, is just giving you his paw, because he's putting it in your hand. You can move your hand different places and he'll still give you his paw, so that's targeting. An easy one to train is a nose target, because dogs will come and naturally investigate, sniff anything really. So if you offer the palm of your hand, yes, he'll come and give it a sniff, and you can teach him to target the palm of your hand in that way, and then you can use that target in various ways. We're going to take it above his nose and backwards to get him into the sit position, and we can do the same with the down. Yes, good boy. And for loose lead walking, well, actually I'll show you the target stick, because the target stick can be trained in exactly the same way. We do some pre-training with it and teach him it's a good idea, build up a good association with him touching it. Yes. And then we can use that in training, because we can use it as a target, and he'll come in on a nice loose lead, yes, towards the target. And in this way he's actually following the target, yes. And we're keeping him on a nice loose lead. The downside to targeting, the advantage to targeting is it's a good hands-off method of getting the dog to move around, and it's a good way of getting a send away or something like that, because you can teach him targeting his paws onto a mat, and then you can put the mat somewhere else, and it helps to teach a send away or a go to bed or behaviours like that. Now the disadvantage to using targeting is that it does take the pre-training first, so you need to do the pre-training before you can use the target to train other things. Now we're going to move on to technique 5, and that's capturing. And capturing is just waiting for the dog to offer the behaviour we want to reinforce, and then reinforcing it. So if we're waiting for a sit, good boy Benny, if we're waiting for a sit, we'll just wait for the dog to go into a sit, however long it takes. There's no pressure on the dog. When he does, we'll go over, we'll give him a reinforcer for doing that, or we'll use the clicker. It's important that we give him the reinforcer while he's in that position, or we click while he's in that position, because if he moves before that happens, we may be reinforcing the wrong behaviour. Now what was we doing? We were doing capturing this. So if we were going to capture a down, we do exactly the same with a down. We'll wait for him to go into a down, and we'll go and reinforce that behaviour. And if we were going to capture loose lead walking, we might wait for him to offer the loose lead, yes, in a nice loose lead next to us, and then we'll reinforce that. And when I say yes here, I'm using it a little bit like you would use a clicker, because he knows that that's associated with him, that's been classically conditioned with the food, and he knows that he's getting a reinforcer and he's got something right. So the disadvantage to using capturing is that it might take a long time for the dog to offer that behaviour, and you've got to be ready when he does with your reinforcer. And the advantage to it is that the dog's not under any pressure at all. He's just getting reinforcement, he's getting something nice for doing a behaviour he was going to do anyway, so there's no pressure on the dog, so that's really nice. Technique 6 is environmental stimulation. Environmental stimulation is setting up the environment to our advantage, so we're more likely to get the behaviour that we want. So if we was going to use the environment to train you're okay Barney, you're pacing today. If we was going to use the environment to train, say a sit, well, when we did the sit with Barney with the lure and reward, and we took the food backwards over his nose, he went into the sit. But some dogs don't do that. Some dogs will just walk backwards, and if you've got a dog like that, and I've had them in the past, then we could use the corner of the room and have the dog facing us. He's in the corner facing us, his bum's in the corner, and we could do that luring action then, and he's more likely to go into the sit because he's got nowhere to go. He can't walk backwards anymore. I won't show that with Barney because Barney's trained to walk backwards around in a circle, and that's what he does if I try that in the corner. So if we was going to use environmental stimulation to get a down, maybe we might encourage him to come under an item, like a low item, like a table or a chair, and I'm going to use some luring here to lure him under. So I nearly took the chair with you. So I didn't lure him into a down exactly, but I lured him under the chair. So I set up the environment to my advantage. If we're going to use environmental stimulation for loose lead walking, we're just doing it indoors is a great thing to do because you're not competing with the stimuli that's outside, the grasses and smells the other dogs. So you're more likely to get the behaviour. But what you could also do is maybe have him on a lead on your left and find an alleyway or a corridor or something like that, and maybe have a shopping trolley or a children's buggy, something like that, just here to your left in front of him, and you could walk along and you'd be using the environmental setup to keep him in that position, and you're more likely to get the behaviour that you want. And the advantage to environmental stimulation is that if you can set up the environment the way you want it to your advantage, you're more likely to get the behaviour that you want. The disadvantage is that it can be difficult to set up the environment, especially if you're working outdoors, because you're not in total control of that environment. Now we're going to move on to modelling, and modelling allows us to physically put the dog in a position we want him in. Barney, come here. So if we want Barney in a sit, we could pull up on his collar slightly and push down on his bum, and if we wanted him in a down, I'll start him in the sit position. If we wanted him in a down, we could start in the sit, and we don't need modelling with this dog, do we? Sit. We could start him in the sit, and then we could bring his legs physically forward and bring him into the down. Or if we was going to model loose lead walking, we may, come on Barney, we may hold the lead nice and loose, but I'm holding onto his harness here, so I'm modelling this loose lead walking. Now, there is an advantage to modelling, and that's that if you use good association and do pre-training with a little touch, yes, and build that up over time, yes, you can use positive reinforcement for the dog to enjoy being manhandled a little bit and being moved around and changed position. When it goes to a veterinary examination, then the dog may be less stressed because he's used to being moved around in that way physically. The disadvantage to modelling is that dogs, all animals, are naturally resistant to being pushed or pulled. If someone grabs you by the collar and tries to pull you, you will resist or you'll try to pull backwards, and this is a natural thing to do. So it's not a good way to start off it's not good for our relationship with a dog. It's not a good way to start off training because you've already got a natural resistance there. There's also health and safety implications involved here, because if you've got a fearful dog maybe, or a reactive dog, or an aggressive dog, and you're trying to push that dog into a certain position using force, then it could result in you getting a bite from that dog. So we've got to be very careful with using such procedures as modelling. Also, the dog's not choosing to go into that position. He's not got a choice about it. You're physically putting him there. So using some degree of force, and for a lot of trainers, and I'm one of them, this is an unethical way to train a dog. But that brings me on to talking about legislation and building a good relationship with your dog. And the Animal Welfare Act of 2006 does state that it's a criminal offence for your action or your inaction to cause unnecessary suffering to a dog, or well, any protected animal. A dog is a protected animal, and the dog has got a right to a suitable environment and a suitable diet, and to behave in normal and to participate in normal animal behaviours. But we can do much more than we can go much further than the 2006 Animal Welfare Act to build a really good relationship with our dogs, and there's things we can be doing every day with our dogs, things like grooming them, handling them every day, spending time with them separately if you've got more than one dog, so spending time with Daisy, spending time with Barney separately, playing with your dogs every day. And we can bring in the 5-second rule here, where we can play maybe wrestling. Barney likes to play wrestling. We can play wrestling with him for 5 seconds and stop, and we see if he's interested in carrying on, or if he'd rather just walk off somewhere else. And we can tell that way whether the dog's actually enjoying the behaviour, the play, as much as we might think he is. There's other things we can do, like going for nice walks in the woods, letting them run through streams and puddles and just get muddy and be a dog, meet up with other people with friendly dogs that you know, and let them have a good play and meet other dogs. We can join dog clubs and dog agility, have a go at that sort of thing, as long as these dog clubs are using kind and compassionate methods. We can use hand feeding instead of putting all the food in a bowl in the morning and that food is just gone on one good association when you give it to the dog. We could keep that food back and weigh it in the morning so you know how much you're giving, and then just call the dog every now and again, give him a handful of food. Every time you put the kettle on, have a little training session, put some in a cardboard box, in a treat ball, let him work out how to get it out. Lots and lots and lots, like maybe 50, 60, 70 good associations between you and the dog throughout the day with that food, instead of just putting it all on the food and walk it all on the floor and walking away. But the very best thing we can do is to always use kind and compassionate methods of training, not just when you've got time or when you're feeling happy, but always to use kind and compassionate methods of training. And this will allow your dog to always be able to trust you, and that is just lovely, to have a dog that you know trusts you 100%.